a lot of this information is going to be review from Unit 2, which was our histology unit, just going through each of the major type of muscle tissues, and then kind of breaking that down a little bit further into the skeletal muscle and what that looks like under a microscope. So let's go ahead and look at. All right, so general overview of muscle. Muscles are going to be the organs that generate the force to produce movement. In order for the muscles to work effectively, especially with like our big movements like moving our arms and legs, the muscles will work directly with the skeletal system to make the entire broad range movement occur. So some examples of muscular movements, breathing, which is the contraction of the diaphragm muscle, walking, which is contraction of multiple legs and core muscles to help keep you upright, the pumping of blood, that's the contraction of cardiac muscles inside of the heart, and then also some smooth muscle that's found within the blood vessels. And then moving our food through the digestive system is contraction of smooth muscles, mostly smooth muscles in the digestive organs. So here's some of that review information. 3 types of muscle tissue. Review over skeletal muscles. Again, these are going to be the muscles that the job is to move the body in our broad range motion. These contraction types, they will tire very easily and they have to rest a lot. So when you contract like your arm muscles, you can only contract them for so long, and then your body will start to wear out. And then over time, you'll have to build up stamina to allow for yourself to continue contracting those muscles for a longer set of time as you go through repetitions. Their description is they're these long tube-shaped fibers. And so if we're looking at each of these tubes as a single cell, notice how each one has multiple nuclei. So we consider these multinucleated. Again, a big part of that is because there is so much damage that could happen to the cell that if damage happens to one of the nucleus, you need some backup to make sure that mitosis happens correctly. These are voluntary contractions. You get to pick and choose when these muscles work, and they're striated. And so here's those striations where you see these bands of some light color and then some dark color. So we can see those on each of our cells. Smooth muscle location is going to be found in the walls of the visceral organs. So these are our internal organs. Digestive organs in the alimentary canal are all lined with smooth muscle. And their job is to force fluids and other substances through the internal channels, particularly through peristalsis. There are these elongated cells that kind of remind me of like an eyeball or like an eye or kind of like a teardrop. Their contractions are very slow and sustained, so they do not wear out quickly. For the most part, you never have like muscle cramps that are directly affiliated with the smooth muscle within your organs. If you have like an abdominal muscle cramp, that's typically from the skeletal muscle in the core of your abdominal region. Each of these muscle cells is going to be uninucleated, so there's only one nucleus in each of the cells. Again, mainly because there's not a lot of damage that occurs to these cells, so we don't really worry too much about nucleus damage then impacting mitosis. These are involuntary contractions and they are unstriated. See how we don't have those bands of light and dark. When we compare to skeletal muscle, we definitely see those bands. And then we also see those bands in cardiac muscle. So the cardiac muscle, this is found in the heart only. And the contraction type is typically steady, but sometimes that rate will vary with blood pressure and also with pulse or heart rate. These cells look like branching chains of cells, so parts of one cell will just kind of flow into another part of another cell. These guys are going to be mostly uninucleated, so one nucleus. Sometimes they're binucleated, it just kind of depends on the situation. But a fun fact about cardiac muscle is that it does not go through mitosis. So cardiac tissue damage results in lifelong cardiac tissue damage or cardiac muscle damage. These are involuntary contractions. We can't control them. And again, they're striated. We can see those definite bands of dark and then light and then dark and then light. And we'll talk about the importance of those a little bit later in this unit. So, our main functions of muscles are going to be to produce movement overall, that's their main goal. From there, the muscles are also used to maintain posture. So, that's what allows us to stand up straight, to stand up at all, to sit up straight. It also stabilizes our joints. Without muscles, our joints would just slip in and out. And then they also generate heat. We talked about, I believe, all the way back in Unit 2, how 90% of your body heat comes from muscle. Some of the specialized functions, depending on where the muscle tissue is and what type. Skeletal muscles also help for protection. So not only are they causing those broad range movements, but they're also helping to protect your internal organs, especially those that don't have bone protection. So think about like your abdominal region, how your intestines and your bladder, there's not there's not bone protection there. So if you're bracing yourself for impact, you'll flex or you'll contract your abdominal muscles to help create that barrier. And then smooth muscles also form valves to help regulate the passage of substances, particularly in the cardiovascular system, so for blood going through our blood vessels, and then the lymphatic system with lymph fluid going through our lymphatic vessels. So overall, when we're looking at skeletal muscles, so now we're particularly focusing on the muscles that make up the things that we use for broad movement. Each skeletal muscle is serviced by one major nerve, one major artery, and at least one major vein. So what this means is that muscles are very bloody and very innervated, so they feel everything. And if you've ever had like a workout or you've gone to PE and you really exerted yourself physically, and then the next day you're sore, that is because of the nerves that are in those muscles. So, just like with the bone, long bones that we talked about and how there were connective tissues that surrounded them, skeletal muscle has a very similar kind of breakdown. So, there are some connective tissue sheaths, which just means that there's connective tissue that kind of encompasses the muscle. Our first connective tissue sheath is called the epimysium, or also pronounced as epimysium. And so where this root word epi means surface, this is going to be on all the way on the very outside of the muscle that kind of holds the entire muscle together. The epimysium blends in with what's called fascia, and fascia is going to be used to separate each of the skeletal muscles. So this is how we differentiate between like different muscles in the arms or different muscles in the legs. Is there's this muscle or this tissue called fascia that kind of separates each of the major muscles, but then the muscle groups are held together by the epimysium. As that connective tissue goes beyond the muscle, it'll bunch together and create tendons, and then that tendon will connect with the periosteum of the bone. And we kind of talked about this last unit, but we'll discuss again. And then the epimysium can also make what's called aponeuroses, which is a broad tissue covering that connects similar group of muscles. So as kind of mentioned, that your leg muscles are all kind of held together by this aponeurosis, which is made up of epimysium. The perimysium, peri means outside. So this is going to be a connective tissue that will surround what's called fascicles, and we'll get to that vocabulary term in a moment. And then surrounding each individual muscle cell is what's called the endomysium, which endo means into. So overall, the muscle fibers will contract, it'll pull on the sheath, and then that pulls on the bone, which causes the movement. So here we're looking at basically like an overview of what we just saw on the last slide. So surrounding the entire muscle would be our epimysium, and as that comes together, that will create the tendon, which then just kind of like flows right into the periosteum of the bone. Then each of these smaller circles within the muscle, each of these is called a fascicle, and each fascicle is surrounded by the perimysium. And then each muscle fiber or each muscle cell is surrounded by the endomysium. So it's kind of like a single cell surrounded by a tissue, put a bunch of them together, surrounded by a tissue, which is the paramecium. Take a bunch of those, put them together, and then bind them together, which is the epimecium. And we're going to do an activity with that in class. All right, myofibrils. Myofibrils are going to be these little teeny tiny fibers. And when you bring those together, you will make one muscle fiber. Then when you take a bunch of muscle fibers and put them together, that will make the muscle cell or the myocyte. Each of the myofibrils contains what's called a sarcomere, and this is the contracting part of the muscle cell. So by itself, very little, but when you have thousands of them all put together, that's when you get the big muscle contraction. The sarcomeres are made up of what are called myofilaments, and then the myofibrils, when coming together, show the striations, and those are those bands of dark and light that we saw in that we'll see on the next slide. The dark bands are also known as A bands. The light bands are also known as I bands. And then actin and myosin are proteins that, when they come together, causes the muscle contraction. So when we're looking at, again, here's kind of a very blown up picture of a muscle. So this entire thing would be our muscle fiber. Um, and so when we kind of zoom in on that, the muscle fiber, this whole thing, is made up of many myofibrils. Inside of the myofibril, we would have those myofilaments. So each of these little teeny tiny red dots is a myofilament. So hundreds of myofilaments makes a myofibril. Hundreds of myofibrils makes a muscle fiber. And then all of the muscle fibers put together makes the muscle. And then looking at our thin filaments versus thick filaments, this is what allows for the muscle to contract. So, and we'll talk about this picture a lot more in class, but each of these contracting units is called a sarcomere. And then the thin filament is known as myosin, or excuse me, actin, and then the thick filament is known as myosin. The neuromuscular junction, this is kind of an segue into our next unit, which we'll cover after we get back from winter break. But just kind of understanding that the nervous system has a lot to do with the muscular system as well. So between the nervous system, the muscular system, and the skeletal system, this is what allows for basically all movement, like broad range, controllable movement. So skeletal muscles will only contract when stimulated by what's called a motor neuron, which is a particular type of nervous system cell. And then each of these skeletal muscle fibers, or each of the cells, is functionally connected to the axon of a motor neuron, which creates a synapse. Let me kick it to the next slide here. So a synapse is this gap right here between the neuron and then going into what's called the sarcoplasm of the muscle fiber. So they're not actually touching each other. There is a gap, but that gap allows for these neurotransmitters to go through. And that's what this next piece is that the neuron will communicate with the muscle fiber with chemicals, which are called neurotransmitters. And then when that whole thing together, so the synapse with the skeletal muscle fiber with the neuron, when all of that is put together, we call it a neuromuscular junction. If the neuromuscular junction is interrupted, then that can cause differences in the neuromuscular in the movement of the muscular system. It can cause something called too much tone, which we call hypertonia, or too little tone, which is hypotonia. So remember, hyper means excessive, hypo means low or too little. It can also cause signals to go to the wrong muscles or muscle groups, which can cause involuntary movement, which we frequently refer to as spasms. And so some examples of this are ALS, which is also called Lou Gehrig's disease, cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, and multiple sclerosis. We'll talk about these more when we get to the nervous system, but just kind of a lot of